It's been a few months since the Nikon Z6 was announced, and at the time it was released, it looked extremely promising for video shooters. Let's face it, if you are a Nikon shooter, the odds are pretty high that your video shooting experience has been lackluster to this point. Nikon's DSLRs have never really fully embraced video production, with a lack of features like focus peaking, poor autofocus performance, and an overall shortage of recording options. With the Z6, that seemed to change, with all those features now packaged into a small and lightweight body, yet boasting a full-frame sensor and even adding N-Log, high bitrate recording options, and 422 10-bit via an external HDMI recorder. It looked extremely promising. And it is. The Nikon Z6 is, without a doubt, Nikon's best video shooting camera they have ever released, and it's not close. Simultaneously, the Z6 is sort of just okay when compared to the market it currently finds itself in. Among a very competitive space, the compromises made in Nikon's first two full-frame mirrorless cameras lands it squarely in the middle of the pack, with little that makes it feel like a unique shooting experience, and with few rewards for choosing it over long-standing competition. So while we should spend time praising the Z6 for everything it finally does right under the banner of Nikon, it is also important to recognize we cannot review these products in a vacuum. I'm going to start out here stating one thing I'm pretty confident with saying. If you're super serious about shooting video, you're going to want to always be shooting with an external recorder when it comes to the Z6. That's not to say the standard profile 420 8-bit 4K P24 video looks bad, but it's also not outstanding in any way either. It's fine, just fine. Looking at footage from various lighting conditions shot in Nikon standard profile without fine-tuning looked extremely contrasty. Without making any adjustments to it, the default settings for the Z6 really want to crush blacks. Though this can look very dramatic and is a popular look these days, if you're not a fan of it, like me, you can get around this by changing contrast settings in camera, and you also have access to neutral and flat profiles, which have significantly less contrast. Though you can do this, one of the advantages of Nikon's competitors is that they either offer log profiles for internal recording, like Sony or Panasonic, have a stellar standard profile out of the box, Canon, or both, also Canon. With the Z6, if you don't like its very contrasty look, you really have to fiddle with its settings for internal recording, or use an external recorder and just always shoot in log. Shooting in 1080p is a significant downgrade from shooting in 4K, as is pretty common with hybrid cameras these days with few exceptions. The Panasonic GH5 finally gave shooters excellent 1080p recording after the GH4 struggled with the same problems, for example. In this case, you can see a 1080p clip and compare it to the internal 4K recording. The 1080p clip is upscaled because the video itself is 4K. The Nikon Z6 features in-body image stabilization, and by doing so leaves only Canon alone on the "we don't offer that feature" island. What I want to say about stabilization is that at times it felt great and at other times felt inconsistent. In this series of clips taken with the Z6, I was handheld with stabilization active. In one clip, you can clearly see motion. In the next, it looks pretty good. I can't explain why, in some cases it worked better than others, but side by side with the Panasonic GH5, one of the best, if not the best IBIS examples in the industry, handheld without moving looks pretty much identical. In this case, Nikon does very well. But when you add motion to it, like walking, the story changes. Suddenly there is a vast difference between Nikon's performance and the GH5's. In any case, having IBIS as a feature is always better than not having it, and though the Nikon shows inconsistencies in several places and is outright worse than the competition in others, it's still good to see it on the device. I mentioned earlier that you always want to be shooting with an external recorder if you're serious about video, and that is because the N-Log profile is only available if you are using an external recorder and capturing 422 10-bit. N-Log is fabulous, honestly, and if you want the best that the Z6 can offer you, this is where you're always going to want to be. It's a shame that this is not available internally for whatever reason, because it's a very versatile log profile that shares a lot in common with Panasonic's Vlog, as the grading here shows. Autofocus, a lot like the in-body image stabilization, is kind of a mixed bag. Tracking isn't intuitive to initiate. You have to activate it with an additional button press rather than having it either activate via the menu or through tapping the touchscreen, but it does work pretty well. When you have a subject walking towards the camera is capable of following their movements very well without missing focus. When shooting something like a set piece or a scene that you have to have complete control over, you should have no problem keeping your subject in focus using either internal recording or N-Log. The latter here being a very pleasant surprise given Nikon's statement about reduced AF performance in N-Log. When moving between two focus points in a frame, one close and another far, in both internal recording and N-Log, the camera didn't do a good job. Tapping two focus points on the rear LCD resulted in the camera spending a moment to hunt right after shifting focus, a hallmark of contrast-based autofocus technology. This means you can't rely on the autofocus to give you a smooth transition focus without it looking like obvious autofocus. This is a problem cameras like the A7 III and the S1 have managed to avoid. Additionally, the focus points on the rear of the camera don't feel particularly accurate. Even when tapping the same locations back and forth to select focus, the Z6 seemed to waver on where it exactly would try and pick up focus, and it wasn't always exactly where I tapped on the rear LCD. Sometimes it would be a bit to the right or to the left of the intended target. In a focusing case like this, I cannot recommend trusting the autofocus at all. I want to end here by showing the ISO performance of the Z6, which is very impressive. Side by side, take a look at the internal standard profile versus N-Log. N-Log limits your ISO recording to 800 to 51,200, hence why you don't see any feed from the N-Log in the lower ISOs. In both cases, and perhaps more in N-Log, the ISO performance is outstanding. Though 25,600 and above is probably too noisy for high-level shooters, many Z6 owners are going to be very happy with the level of noise control exhibited by the Z6, both in N-Log and in standard. Boy, have we come a long way with ISO performance, and the Z6 is one of the most impressive examples of this in a Nikon camera to date. So where do we stand with the Z6? Well, there are a host of niggling details that should have been addressed with firmware before launch, and those are listed in our full review on imagingresource.com. Overall, the firmware feels at best untuned for a video shooter's expectations, and at worst unfinished. There are extra steps across multiple functions that make the camera feel like it's fighting you instead of working with you. These issues could be fixed via a firmware update, but at the time of this review, they are an annoyance I could not ignore. Combine these firmware issues with no internal log recording and a just okay IBIS and autofocus, and you have a video camera that, while exhibiting excellent image quality, is just par for the course overall. Unfortunately, the Z6 doesn't seem to push any boundaries, and though it's easily Nikon's best video camera, comparing it to the field yields a great many concessions based on the competition. One could argue this is a good choice for current Nikon shooters to finally have a Nikon-based camera system for video. At the time of this review, the FTZ mount adapter ships with the Z6 at no additional cost, and certainly helps them sell the system and should convince many current Nikon owners to stay with the brand. For many current Nikon shooters, this will be a strong enough reason to make the Z6 purchase, especially if you shoot both stills and video. But if we are looking at just specs and features for video, it becomes less clear. Including the FTZ adapter now is a great move from Nikon, and makes it easier to recommend to current Nikon DSLR owners. I said at the start of this review, the Z6 is Nikon's best video-capable camera to date, but even as that, it doesn't do enough to stand out from a very competitive crowd to make a compelling case to select it over the competition. This seems first and foremost a camera that gives existing Nikon shooters ample reasons to remain loyal to the brand, but at the same time isn't likely to pull people in from other platforms like Canon, Panasonic, or Sony. To read more about the Nikon Z6, make sure to head on over to imagingresource.com.